The stroke hit on a Tuesday morning in February, which my wife always said was the cruelest month to be sick in Canada. Too cold to feel hopeful, too dark to feel anything at all. I remember standing at the kitchen counter in our house in Oakville, pouring my second cup of coffee, and then the mug was on the floor and I was holding the edge of the counter with both hands, and the left side of my face felt like it had simply decided to stop participating. I didn't fall. That's the part people find surprising when I tell the story. I stayed upright. I grabbed the phone and I called 911 myself, and I remember being oddly proud of that. 67 years old, retired civil engineer, and I was still the kind of man who handled things. The doctors at Halton Healthcare called it a TIA, a transient ischemic attack. A warning stroke, they said, as if the brain sends polite advance notices before it decides to shut everything down. The effects were mostly temporary. Some slurred speech, some weakness in my left hand, some confusion that came and went like bad weather. Within 48 hours, I was sitting up in bed, reading the newspaper, arguing with the nurses about the television volume. By the fourth day, I was nearly myself again. Nearly. That four-letter word did a lot of damage in the weeks that followed. My daughter-in-law arrived at the hospital on the second day. My son, her husband, was working in Fort McMurray at the time, something to do with project management for one of the oil sands operations. He called twice, which I counted because I couldn't help counting. My daughter-in-law, Renee, not the French spelling, she always made that clear, just Renee. She'd correct anyone who added the accent, sat in the chair beside my bed for 2 hours that first visit, and she was kind in the way that people are kind when they want something. Soft voice, lots of touching my arm, asking the nurses questions that made her sound knowledgeable, like she'd been doing research on my behalf. "You gave us quite a scare," she said. I told her I'd given myself quite a scare too. She laughed at that, and then she said something I didn't think much about at the time. She said, "You know, it might be a good idea to get everything sorted out while you're here and we can help, just to take the pressure off you." I said I had a lawyer for that sort of thing, a man named Bill Okafor, who'd been handling my affairs for 12 years, a man I trusted completely. She nodded and said, of course, but maybe while I was recovering, it would be nice to have someone closer to home with access, just in case, just for practical reasons. I said I'd think about it. I was on a blood thinner and a statin and something for blood pressure, and the combination of those and the fluorescent lighting and the interrupted sleep that comes with being in any hospital made me feel not quite like myself. I knew I was functional. I could hold a conversation, I could do arithmetic in my head, I could remember my postal code and my mother's maiden name and the year I graduated from the University of Waterloo. But there was a softness around everything, a slight delay between thought and response, and I could see people noticing it. The nurses were patient in a way that felt careful. My daughter-in-law watched me the way you watch a door you're not sure is locked. My son called on the third evening. He asked how I was feeling, asked about the food, asked if I needed anything. Then, near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, "Dad, Renee mentioned you haven't done anything about the power of attorney stuff. You really should, you know. I mean, not that anything's going to happen, but at your age, at my age, I was 67. I'd run marathons. I'd hiked the West Coast Trail twice. I'd built a career and a marriage and a house and a retirement fund over 4 decades of early mornings and careful decisions. And my son was talking to me like I was a problem that needed to be managed before it got out of hand. "I'll call Bill when I'm home," I said. "Renee can help with the paperwork," he said. "She's right there. It would just be easier." I said I'd think about it, and I meant it as a dismissal, and he heard it as a maybe, which is one of the small failures of our relationship that I'd grown used to over the years. Here is something people don't tell you about strokes, even minor ones: the loneliness of being suspected, not accused of anything, just suspected, of confusion, of forgetting, of not being entirely there. My daughter-in-law brought me a crossword puzzle book the next morning, and I nearly told her I'd been doing the Globe and Mail crossword in pen for 30 years, but I didn't. I filled in 3 clues and set it down and watched her watch me do it, and something crystallized very quietly in the back of my mind. My wife had died 4 years earlier, lung cancer, caught late, gone fast. 7 months from diagnosis to the day I stood in the cemetery in November and stared at a hole in the ground and tried to understand what the rest of my life was supposed to look like. We'd been married 39 years. Her name was Ingrid. She was a high school biology teacher who grew her own vegetables and could identify every bird in southern Ontario by its call, and had very strong opinions about the correct way to make pie crust. I missed her every day in the specific way that you miss someone who knew exactly what you meant before you finished saying it. We had built our life with intention. The house in Oakville was paid off. There was a substantial RRSP, a modest TFSA, non-registered investments through TD, a term life policy that had already paid out. The total, including the property, was somewhere around $2 million. Not extraordinary, not for a couple who'd both worked for 40 years and never overspent, but real, solid, the kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself but is quietly there. My son knew about it. He'd known for years in the vague way that adult children know things they haven't been told directly but have inferred from the size of the house and the holidays and the absence of financial anxiety. He worked in oil and gas and made good money himself, but money has a way of feeling insufficient no matter how much of it you have, and I think the knowledge of what would eventually come to him sat in his mind differently than he let on. Renee had always been careful with me, polite. She sent cards for my birthday and remembered what I took in my coffee and asked after my health in a way that covered all the correct social bases without ever quite being warm. I'd noticed it but told myself I was being unfair, that I didn't know her well enough, that my son had chosen her for reasons I might not fully understand. After 39 years with Ingrid, everyone else's marriage looked a little foreign to me. But I remembered things. A comment she'd made once at Christmas about the house being a lot of space for one person. A question she'd asked about whether I had a financial advisor or managed things myself. The way she'd steered the conversation at a dinner 2 years ago toward the topic of assisted living, not because anyone had raised it, but because she'd raised it, casually, over the roast chicken, mentioning a friend whose father had made smart arrangements early. I'd filed these things away without knowing why. Old habit. I'd spent my career on infrastructure projects, on finding the load-bearing problems before the structure was under stress. You develop a sense for things that don't quite line up. On the 5th day of my hospital stay, Renee arrived in the morning with a Tim Hortons cup and a folder. I had Bill Okafor's office send over some standard forms, she said. I hope that's okay. I just thought it would be easier than you having to deal with all of it when you get home. I looked at the folder. I did not open it. Renee, I said, I've been doing crosswords in pen for 30 years. She smiled. Of course you have. I'll call Bill myself when I'm home, I said. Tell me how the kids are doing. She talked about my grandchildren for 20 minutes and left the folder on the table beside my crossword book. I waited until she left, and then I picked it up and looked at the documents inside. There were 2. One was a continuing power of attorney for property, the document that would allow someone to manage all of my financial affairs, including bank accounts, investments, and real estate, even if I became mentally incapacitated. The other was a personal care power of attorney, giving someone authority over my medical and personal decisions. Both documents named my son as the attorney for property, and Renee as the alternate, the person who would step in if he was unavailable. I set them back in the folder. I set the folder on the table. I drank the rest of my coffee and looked out the window at the February sky. I called Bill Okafor the next morning from my hospital phone. He was in a meeting, so I left a message. He called back that afternoon. I told him about the folder. There was a silence on his end that told me he understood the situation. "I didn't send those forms," he said. "I know," I said. "Gerald, Bill had known me long enough to use my name like that, plain and direct. I want you to listen to me. Don't sign anything. Not while you're in the hospital, not when you get home, not until we talk in person. Are we clear?" We were clear. I was discharged on a Thursday. My son had flown in from Fort McMurray by then. His arrival timed, I noticed, to coincide with my discharge, which could have been coincidence but which felt, given everything, like something else. He helped me to the car. He carried my bag. He was solicitous in a way that reminded me of Renee in the hospital, that particular quality of helpfulness that has an agenda underneath it. They made dinner at my house that first night. Chicken and roasted potatoes. It was good. We talked about the grandchildren, about his project in Fort McMurray, about the weather. Nobody mentioned the folder. Over the following 2 weeks, it came up 3 more times. Once when my son mentioned very casually that he'd run into Bill Okafor at a hockey game, and Bill had seemed a bit out of touch with modern estate planning. Once when Renee left a printout on my kitchen counter about a Scotiabank service that consolidated accounts and required a joint signatory. Once, the most direct of the 3, when my son sat across from me at my own kitchen table and said, "Dad, I'm just trying to protect you. What happens if you have another one and it's worse? We need to be able to help." I said I understood his concern. I said I'd been in touch with Bill, and we were working through some updates. This was true. What I didn't tell him was what those updates were. In the weeks after I came home, I did something I'd never needed to do before. I went through everything. Bank of Montreal checking and savings. I changed the passwords and enabled 2-factor authentication and removed the emergency access I'd once added for vague future contingency. TD investment accounts, same. The brokerage accounts, the RRSP and TFSA. I called each institution individually, which took the better part of 3 days and involved a great deal of hold music, but I spoke with a real person at every single one and made certain that any changes to account access would require my physical presence and a signed request verified by my lawyer's office. I called my financial advisor at Edward Jones and told him that if anyone contacted him on my behalf, anyone at all, including my son, including my son's wife, he was to call me directly before taking any action. He was a careful man named Bertrand who'd been managing the investment side of my portfolio since Ingrid died, and he listened without interruption and said, "Understood. I'll make a note." I also, on Bill's advice, had a formal cognitive assessment done at a clinic in Mississauga. I told the appointment scheduler it was a follow-up to the TIA. The psychologist who evaluated me was a young woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she walked me through 2 hours of memory exercises, pattern recognition, verbal fluency, executive function. At the end, she told me my scores were well within normal range for my age, that there was no indication of cognitive impairment, and that I could request a written report. I requested 3 copies. I gave one to Bill. I kept one in the filing cabinet beside my desk. I put one in the safety deposit box at the Bank of Montreal branch on Lakeshore Road, and then I waited. The call came on a Monday. I was sitting in my living room watching the news, something about a Senate committee which I've found is the best sleep aid known to man, when my phone rang. It was Bertrand at Edward Jones. "Gerald," he said, "I've got your daughter-in-law on the other line. She says she's acting as your authorized representative and she's requesting a full account summary and transfer authorization form. I told her I needed to verify that with you first. Should I put her on hold?" "You can disconnect her," I said. There was the briefest pause. "All right," he said. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after that. The authorization she'd tried to invoke was based on a document, a letter claiming to be from Bill Okafor's office, designating her as my financial representative during my ongoing recovery. Bill had written no such letter. He confirmed this within 20 minutes of my calling him. The letterhead and signature were, as he put it carefully, not from my office. It was a forgery. I want to be clear about something. I had loved my son in the complicated way that fathers love sons who grew up to be people they don't entirely recognize. I had done my best. I had paid for university, had helped with the down payment on his first condo, had shown up to things I didn't always want to attend, and said things I didn't always entirely feel, because that is what you do when you love someone, and you are trying not to lose them entirely to the distance that grows between people who are too different and too proud to bridge it comfortably. But there is a line, and they had crossed it in a direction I could not uncross for them. Bill filed a report with the Ontario Provincial Police the following week. The investigation took several months, and I won't recount all of it because the procedural parts are tedious, and I was not, for much of it, privy to the details. What I can tell you is that the forged document was traced, that my daughter-in-law retained a lawyer, and that my son, when it became clear that the situation was not going to quietly resolve itself, called me twice. The first call he told me I was being unreasonable. The second call, he cried, which was the first time I'd heard him cry since he was a teenager, and it didn't make things easier, it just made them sadder. I updated my will that spring. Bill and I sat in his office on a Thursday afternoon and went through it methodically, the way I'd once gone through the load calculations on a highway overpass in Brampton, accounting for every force, every point of stress, every scenario in which something might give way. I left my son a sum that covered the original help I'd given him over the years, the university, the condo down payment, and no more. I wanted it to be a number that acknowledged our history without pretending it was still intact. To my grandchildren, his two kids, who were 12 and 9 and had done nothing wrong, I set up registered education savings plans with enough in each to cover a full university education, fully protected and designated to them directly, not to their parents. My granddaughter had asked me once, during a visit, if it hurt to have a stroke. I told her it hurt my pride more than anything. She'd nodded very seriously and patted my hand and gone back to her book. I want her to be able to do whatever she wants with her life. I also established at Ingrid's old high school a bursary in her name for graduating science students. It wasn't enormous, but it was enough to matter, and I sat in the principal's office on a rainy April afternoon and signed the paperwork and thought about Ingrid, identifying every bird in the yard by sound, and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since February. The remaining assets I designated to a combination of causes: the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, the local conservation authority, where Ingrid used to volunteer on weekend trail restoration, and a small organization in Hamilton that provides legal assistance to seniors navigating financial exploitation. I found that last one through Bill, and when I asked him how many of his clients needed something like it, he looked at the window for a moment before he answered. "More than you'd think," he said. "I live alone in my house in Oakville. I make my own coffee. I do the Globe and Mail crossword in pen, which I mention not because it matters but because it's a small, reliable pleasure, and reliable pleasures are something I've learned to pay attention to. I go to a cardiac rehab group on Tuesdays at the hospital where I had my TI, which sounds more depressing than it is. There are some genuinely funny people in that room, and we have coffee afterward, and one man, a retired professor from McMaster, beats me at chess reliably enough that I've started studying openings again just to keep up. I think about my son. I think about the specific kind of loneliness of discovering that the people who should love you simply are not able to love you the way you needed. I spent a long time wondering, in those first months, whether I'd failed him somehow, whether I'd been too distant or too demanding or not present enough in the right ways. I still don't know. I'm not sure the answer matters as much as I once thought it did. What I know is this. I was in a hospital bed on a blood thinner with a soft edge on my thinking and a folder on the table beside me, and I didn't sign it. Not because I was suspicious at that exact moment, Not because I'd seen through everything, I hadn't, but because I knew my own lawyer's name, because I knew my own mind, because 47 years of building things that needed to hold weight had taught me that the most important thing you can do when the pressure comes is to know exactly what you're standing on. I was standing on something solid. It turned out that was enough.